John, don't you know who I am, England?
Hello,
What's up?
Tyler Richard Jones.
Good afternoon.
Did I get your middle name right?
It's close enough. We'll take it. Nobody would know if you didn't. How you doing?
You would know. Doing well. It's a lovely evening here where I am, and I hope it's lovely where you are as well.
Oh, it is. It is a lovely evening. It's getting dark earlier around here, and we're feeling it. I've I've kind of set some pretty high expectations for our guest today. I hope you don't mind.
No, I think you should.
So typically we have a little thank you that we like to send out that says, "I'm John's favorite guest on With the Stone Rolling." And this time I had such high expectations of Alex today that I sent her this gift prematurely, knowing that she was going to be your favorite guest by the end of this.
Yeah, you're right. Good job.
So yeah, pressure's on, but I'm sure she'll live up to it.
She will.
This will be
She will.
great.
We have a very exciting episode today. We have, well, I'll introduce her in a second, but we're going to be talking about some very cool stuff with a very cool person, and I've been looking forward to it for a long time, and I think our listeners will enjoy it.
I feel like I use this one a little much. Can you get any more generic on that?
Me?
We're talking about some cool stuff with a cool guest, and you've been looking forward to it, and our listeners will enjoy it.
Yeah. So our guest is a person, and I know her, and she knows things, and she's going to talk about those things, which are good. They're good things,
And,
and
and 90 minutes from now, she will be your favorite guest we've ever had.
yep. All right. I'll
So
just should,
Dr. Alex Griffin, right?
yes. Does that? Sorry. Is that my cue to introduce her?
Sure, whatever you want. It's your show. You do what you want.
My show.
I just didn't know what you were stalling for.
All right. All right. It's my show, apparently. Okay. So, Alex Griffin is a very dear friend of mine. Um, we went to the same undergrad institution. We went to the same graduate institutions. She's a visiting assistant professor at the New College of Florida, where she teaches courses on religion, including courses that specialize in Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, Catholicism, the Black Church, race and gender in American religion, and Christianity in America. Her PhD is in religious studies from Arizona State University. And she has 3 recent publications on Mormonism, Catholicism, and religion religion and how it interacts with disabilities. Sorry, that was very clumsy. But again, she's very bright, wonderful person, and I present to you all Dr. Alex Griffin.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted. And yeah, I have to live up to the Tumblr. So I'm excited.
Oh, no problem. No problem. The Tumblr is pretty spectacular, but
It is.
But there's no pressure at all.
I was telling you guys earlier, John said that I would get a Tumblr, and I say this with nothing but love, John. I wasn't sure. I'm never a hundo on whether you're joking about something or not. And so I was like, oh, like maybe. But I kind of forgot about it. And then I got a package and I was like, I don't think I ordered anything, but I opened it. So apparently if you want to like poison me by mail or something, it's a good way to do it since I just
know where to
stuff.
Find you.
Yeah.
Well, here's the joke. If this goes poorly, you have to return it to the address.
Okay.
Labeled, so.
Makes sense. But yeah, like I opened it and then realized what it was and was like dying laughing.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we don't just hand those out willy-nilly. Although if anyone wants to buy one, we could definitely arrange for that. Right,
Tyler? Buy your way into being a favorite guest.
Yep.
Yeah. You can buy anything from me if you got enough money.
we should
tumblers, pens, pencils. We'll have them custom made, whatever you want.
Yeah, I'm like, there's a whole merch universe out there you could be exploring.
Yeah, coasters, t-shirts, doorstops, phone cases, iPhone cases. Tyler can make that happen.
All right.
Yeah, so it's a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for making time.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, we appreciate you being here in our little podcast corner. And today we invited you in today because we're going to be talking about Doctrine and Covenants, section 49, which is a great example of how early Mormonism related to other religious movements of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And this is sort of your specialization, right? And so, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say I mostly, I don't know that I specialize in them, but I love the Shakers. I think they're very interesting. I'm always inflicting them on my students in various contexts. So yeah, when you were like, oh, is there like a source you would want to talk about if you came on the show, I instantly was like, I'm ready. Like I knew exactly what I want. I'm like D&C 49. So
Yep. Before the text was even sent out, you were responding. Section 49.
Yeah, you just suddenly get a text from me that's like D&C 49.
Yeah.
Yes.
So great. So yeah, I'll just say a little bit about section 49 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So this was written in 1831. It's an important section. It talks about a lot of different things. It talks about the millennium, second coming, end of the world type stuff. And it was given to a new member of the Mormon movement named Lyman Copley, or Copley. And Copley was living just northeast of Kirtland, I believe, or very, very near Kirtland.
Close by, yeah.
Yeah. And he joined the church after the church had moved to Kirtland. And at the time, he belonged to not a community of Shakers, but like a parish, I guess.
We can talk about his relationship with the Shakers is actually kind of weird, which we can maybe talk about that later too.
Yeah, because it makes it sound in Doctrine and Covenants 49 that he was, all in like a full-on member, but it kind of eliminates the nuance that a lot of religious movements have, which is, of course, various degrees of activity, right?
Yeah, he was almost more like Shaker adjacent. But yeah, we can get to that when we talk about
Cool. Yeah, so the context around the section is that sometime in May 1831 he met with Joseph Smith, and we don't have like a specific record of that meeting, but it's safe to assume that he and Smith had a conversation around the Shaker movement, Shaker beliefs, and how they compare to what Smith was teaching in his movement.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the way I pictured it is the two of them got together. They asked each other questions. You have a prayer here and a little prayer there, and voila, you have section 49. So with that in mind, Alex, maybe you can set the stage for us and talk to us a little bit about. Back up a little bit. The Shakers were somewhat of a millennial movement, and we know Mormons, same thing. Latter-day Saints. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about millennial movements at this time. Like, what is millennialism? What was going on in North America during this time?
Sure. Yeah, Shakers and the other. I mean, there's lots of, like you said, there's lots of millenarian movements popping up at the time, which generally is used to mean, in a religious context, specifically like in a Christianity related context, believing that, Jesus is returning soon, or that the end of the world is around the corner in some capacity. You occasionally hear people use the term millenarian outside of religious context to refer to other stuff, but like, we're here to talk about religion. So, and yeah, you had during this time period, probably most famously the Millerites, which were a kind of widespread, very active religious movement led by Lee Miller, who was a kind of a lay Baptist preacher, if I recall, who started predicting the end of the world, had like a really elaborate reading of the book of Daniel that led him to calculate when he thought the world was going, like that Jesus would come back and the world would end. And there's actually this kind of climactic event where all of his followers, are ready, and the date comes and goes, and nothing happens. And it gets referred to as the Great Disappointment, which I think we need to go back to naming events that way, because I think
such a good title.
It's like such a good title for an event.
Yeah.
Like we just need to go back to like giving things really dramatic titles, in my opinion.
Yep.
And later in the 19th century, this is much later at this point, I mean, but there's even things like the ghost dance movement among Native Americans in the Western US, really kind of in this outgrowth of movements that are coming out of the Second Great Awakening. You have a good number that are in some way anticipating the millennium. So Oneida community too. Well, they thought it already started. That's its own other kettle of fish, really. They had their own thing.
We won't talk about them.
Sure.
No. So what was the millennium supposed to look like for the majority of these movements?
So
I know you mentioned that Jesus Christ would return, but what did that look like?
So there's actually kind of two relevant concepts here. You get what's referred to as like pre and post millennialism. So premillennialism, those are terms that kind of refer to whether you think that the millennium, which is envisioned as this like 1,000-year kind of period of like peace and everyone kind of living with each other in a godly and peaceable fashion, I suppose. Depending on your interpretation, sometimes it's like Jesus's reign over the earth. Like, basically, whether you think that happens before or after Jesus returns, right? So premillennialism is this idea that Jesus will come again, and then the millennium begins. Often, but not always, with the belief that there's going to be a lot of kind of trials and tribulations leading up to the return of Jesus. You also get this idea of post-millennialism, which is this idea of the millennium occurs through kind of people, converting and reforming and kind of doing good things and, bringing each other along, and then Jesus shows up. And it's worth noting that there are also like multiple forms of Christianity with zero interest in the concept of the millennium. Including like, numerous large and well-established ones.
Mm-hmm.
But within this context, right, this idea of this period of, peace and people kind of living together harmoniously usually under Jesus's reign in some capacity, although in the premillennial context, right? In the post-millennial context, it's before Jesus comes again. Did that make any sense? Is that even what you asked me?
No, yeah, that was perfect.
Okay.
So, yeah, I would always get these two confused. Like,
it's easy to get them confused.
Because with pre, it was like, wait, does pre mean that Jesus comes first or the millennium comes first?
It's confusing.
And
I always have to like sit and like check which one is which. So
yeah. So someone described it to me this way, and I think I may have done this on the podcast once, but they described it like the Titanic. The Titanic is going out. It's this big, beautiful ship, and everyone's excited about it. It's going well, and then the premillennialists are like, no, the ship is about to sink. It's all going to crap. We got to get out, grab the lifeboats, let's sail away.
Right.
I don't know if that's a very good comparison because the Titanic did sink anyway, but anyway, that's
no, but yeah, I mean,
described it that way.
What were the post-millennialists doing on the Titanic, John?
Rearranging the deck chairs, I guess. No, but I mean, I get what you're saying, which is one of the. I mean, that is kind of one of the things that tended to characterize a lot of people who were into post-millennialism during the 19th and 20th centuries were often really involved. I can talk sometimes. In like various reform movements, right? Because they believed that part of this was like making the world a better place. Sometimes people characterize it as like premillennialism kind of being a pessimistic outlook and postmillennialism being more optimistic. I mean, it's sometimes more complicated than that, but I think that as a generalization, that's reasonable.
Right.
Especially when you think about postmillennialists.
So help me understand this then. Would you consider the typical member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today premillennial or postmillennial? Or is that too complicated to answer? Premillennial.
I think technically premillennial.
Well,
but only in the sense of like the idea that you're waiting for the second coming and then stuff.
That's when things
happens.
are really going to take off.
Right, but and like I said, I think especially in the 19th century, the pessimism, optimism thing was a little more pronounced. I don't know that it's necessarily that way today. That's a good question, though.
Okay, so back then it was more black and white, where people would they have identified as such at the time?
That's a good question. I don't know how much I'm like someone who's not me needs to like there are probably people John and I went to school with who would know the answer to whether. I don't know that millenarian was necessarily being thrown around by the groups themselves. But I mean, like latter day is in the name, right? That's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah. The millennium obviously had a huge impact on how people lived and the decisions they made, but maybe
that's a good question.
I think we touched on this a little bit in episodes past, where there is sort of a shift in early Mormonism, where early on, guys like Oliver Cowdery were all in on the millennium just being right around the corner, right? And that they had to get things going and organized in preparation for that. But then it looks like there's somewhat of a shift in the mid 1830s to where it's like, okay, let's pump the brakes a little bit.
Right. I think. And sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, let's pump the brakes and let's build Zion. And then
I think that kind of complicates the pre-post. That's an interesting. I think,
Did Joseph,
I guess premillennial, but planning ahead in a post.
Like so, I know with Brigham Young, when they get to Utah, it's almost like for him it's a very post-millennial, because he wants to usher in the millennium by redoing the landscape of Utah and building Zion here, and doing all these wonderful things.
Would be though, would he have articulated as we're getting ready and then Jesus will come and then technically the millennium begins?
That's a good question. I mean,
we got to call Brigham Young.
I guess there's other religions that have kind of given a date for the second coming, and when that doesn't occur, then they say, oh, it's because this, that, the other. We weren't usually it comes down to we weren't ready. We did something that to postpone the coming. That's never happened in the Church of Jesus Christ.
In part because there's never been that kind of firm prediction like the Millerites had, or various elements within Jehovah's Witnesses, because there are various other religions that have articulated like a firm deadline. That's never happened.
There's never been a set. This is the day to prepare for.
Right.
So, okay.
Yeah. Right. I think I want to say though that Brigham Young did say something along the lines of like, if we would just get our act together, the millennium would have happened by now.
I mean, that sounds like something he would say.
Yeah. I want to say he did say that, but
that sounds very
and in those words specifically too. If you guys would just get your crap together, then we wouldn't have to worry about this right now.
Kind of sounds like him, I would say.
Anyway, so we've deviated a bit.
We have a Brigham Young impersonator in the house.
I do declare, if you
He's
all,
Southern now?
Yeah,
little foghorn leghorn, my friend. I don't know about that.
What a lot of people don't know about Brigham Young, he was very Southern. Born in Vermont, but he loved that Southern culture.
He acquired a Southern accent at some point, like you do.
Yep. One of Orson Pratt's many problems with him. Why do you keep talking like? Nah, All right. Anyway, sorry, we've digressed. So I think we've established in the early LDS context, they're kind of not really sure where they are on the map, right? Post millennial. What about the Shakers at this time? Were they a little bit more specific, or was there a lot of nuance there as well?
So I think some of what we were talking about just barely is along the lines of also it's kind of difficult to disentangle like the technical theology of either of those stances with like the broader attitude and what actions you're taking.
Right.
Because like technically I think Shakers are premillennial, but they were more focused on just that it was coming.
Okay.
And again, kind of like you mentioned with other groups, right? Early Shakers especially had like a sense of urgency about the end coming, right? About Jesus is coming back soon. But that gets complicated for various reasons. I don't know. Is it time for me to talk about Shakers a little more, or?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I jumped ahead.
No,
a
you're
little.
good. You're good.
Maybe we could back up a bit and you could tell us who were the Shakers, why were they called the Shakers, and
Could I ask one question before we get there? As the person who comes in,
I said no. You said this is my show. Dang it. Fine, ask your question.
I've overridden you.
This is your show, but I have a mute button, so I can mute. Anyway, no. So as the person on the show who claims to have no idea what's going on, I heard John's introduction that we're going to talk about D&C 49 today.
Mm-hmm.
And as many listeners know, we try to focus in on kind of one document that's contemporary to the time period we're looking at, and then talk about the context surrounding that document. So when I heard D&C 49, as the person not knowing what's going on, I've heard so far in this brief discussion that we're talking about the millennium. We're talking about the Shakers now. What could we talk a little bit about what D&C 49 is about, and then kind of go back to what the Shakers are, just so
that'd be
so someone like me can
idea.
understand the context of why are we talking about Shakers when this is supposed to be about something else. And then, John, do I have your permission to ask that question?
Does it even matter? I mean, no. You have the mute button, so I guess this is your show.
It's your show, but I have the mute button.
Whatever.
It's very clear.
I'll just sit over here in the corner, let you two gab. No, just kidding. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So D&C 49 is John kind of gestured to some of it, I think. It's basically a revelation from Joseph Smith to Lehman Copley and a few other people. Lehman Copley or Copley, I don't know. I want to say Copley. Copley just feels weird coming out of my mouth. I'm gonna go with Copley.
Yeah, I think Copley is. I like Copley.
I'm just gonna go with that. Sorry, Lehman, if that's not correct. So yeah, it's basically Joseph Smith telling Lehman Copley and a few other people that basically kind of with the impetus of, John mentioned that Lehman Copley had kind of some association with the Shakers, or he held a lot of Shaker beliefs, but didn't live in a Shaker community, which we'll maybe talk about in a little bit, what that looked like and why that was important to them. And so he's kind of like, one, offering like a theological refutation of various Shaker beliefs and practices. But he's also telling Lehman and who was with him? Sidney Rigdon, I think, was with him. Parley Pratt. And he basically was saying, like, you're going to go deliver this message to the Shakers, basically letting them know that they are incorrect. I'm trying to remember. I'm not super clear on whether, I don't think there was necessarily an anticipation of like Shakers up and converting, although there probably was maybe a little hope of that. But it was, I think, like Lehman Copley definitely plays kind of a significant role there. In that he is kind of like the impetus for this, right?
Okay. So
if he didn't exist, I don't know that D&C 49 would exist.
Oh, I gotcha. So 49 is a revelation given to Joseph Smith
Yes.
that he gave to Signe Rigdon, Parley P. Pratt, and Lehman Copley to go to the Shakers and tell them, hey, this is what the millennium actually is going to be.
Sort of.
Okay, so we can get, but maybe we'll get into the content later. But that's kind of the background of what's going on.
Basically, like here's what you're going to go tell the Shakers.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, and with the millennium stuff, I mean, I think there's actually not as much of that in youth, but I think it's useful for understanding like the commonalities and the differences between Shakers and the LDS during this time period, especially. So the Shakers, they do technically still exist. There are 2 Shakers left, possibly 3. There were 3 at one point when they were having someone on as like a novice for a year, but I don't know if he actually committed to staying. So I'm gonna say 2 for
now.
My God. At the Sabbath Lake Shaker Village in Maine.
Mm-hmm.
And the Shakers are this communal celibate religious group. So they live communally, especially early Shakers, very millenary, right? They're looking for, it's around the corner and also in some ways they're already living it. It's a little complicated. We'll get there. And what's interesting is that I think the Shakers, especially things like Shaker furniture or design or things like that, get really identified with the US, but the Shakers actually come from England originally. They grew out of a group of kind of dissident Quakers actually in the mid 18th century in northern England, kind of in the Manchester area. And this was a period where there was kind of dispute among English Quakers about what does religious practice look like? Right. I don't know. Have either of you been to like a Quaker meeting or like what's known as an unprogrammed Quaker meeting?
It's on my list, but no.
Okay.
Never been to one.
It's interesting. So there are multiple Quaker traditions, including some that look relatively like any other Protestant meeting, but kind of the oldest and still continuing in many Quaker congregations style is what's known as an unprogrammed meeting, where everyone sits in silence together. And then if somebody feels prompted to speak, they speak. There's no formal clergy. There's no plan for the meeting. It's all supposed to be about kind of like whatever you're inspired to say.
Wow.
Quakers have this concept of the inner light. They believe that everyone has kind of this access to knowledge of God, or that, God can speak to people. Broadly speaking, I'm like, I can already in the back of my head, I'm like, well, some Quakers also believe, but I'm being very general.
Yeah.
So during this time period, there's this group of dissident Shakers in Northern England who want to have kind of a more ecstatic religious experience. So while other Shakers are doing the sitting in silence thing, and if you're prompted to speak, you get up and speak fairly normally. These kind of dissident Quakers are, maybe shouting or singing or follow some of the behaviors that we kind of later associate with like the first and second Great Awakenings, which I think you guys have talked about on the show before.
Right. Yep.
Kind of these more like ecstatic religious behaviors. And over time, this group kind of turns into its kind of like a lot of religious groups, right? They kind of start as being part of this larger group and kind of slowly grow away from it. And Shaker, like a lot of religious terms for various religious groups, Shaker actually was initially pejorative. It was meant to insult them.
Really?
Because they were referred to as shaking Quakers because of, that they were, expressing religiosity in various ways. Technically, they are the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. But they're also from what I've seen, even the ones today are like fine with Shaker. They know that that's the term people know them by.
Right.
And so is now a good time for me to talk about Anne Lee?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And
this is just, Anne Lee, wherever the conversation takes you.
Okay, wherever we go. Okay.
Yep.
So Anne Lee was kind of the first leader of the Shakers. She did not originally lead that dissident Quaker group, but by the time it becomes its own kind of separate group with distinctive beliefs and practices, she's in charge. And there's actually a lot we don't know about Anne Lee versus what we do know about Anne Lee.
Okay.
What we do know, she lived from about 1736 to 1784. She's born, in the north of England. Her family was really poor. She never had any kind of formal education. She actually was illiterate for her entire life,
Wow.
which I think in some ways makes it extra interesting that she is able to take on this role of religious leadership.
Yeah.
Although there are many people during that time period, right, who may have been illiterate but had through oral, that they knew a lot of the Bible orally, right?
Right.
And she was kind of in that category. So she gets involved in this dissident Quaker group as a young adult. And over this period of about over a decade, this is like a long process. She doesn't just show up and say, I'm in charge.
Right.
She's involved over, like I said, about the course of a decade. She kind of gradually comes to leadership of the group. And she kind of starts offering her own distinctive teachings and prophecies and things that distinguish her from other people who previously were considered to lead the group. So, for example, she's generally regarded to have introduced the concept of celibacy as like an essential Shaker teaching. She eventually leads a small group of people to the US. She was kind of in trouble in England a lot. She got arrested a lot for doing things like disrupting Church of England services. Turns out people don't like when you show up at their church and yell at them while they're trying to have a service. Who knew? And at the time in England, like you can get arrested for that, right? Like that's an actual crime. So there's a lot of that happening. And so she leads a small group of followers over to the US. And yeah, so I mean, leaving her aside for a minute, and then we'll have to return to her eventually. This is in 1774 when they go over. After a few years, they purchase land in upstate New York. So they kind of become identified with, the flowering of various movements in upstate New York, even though they kind of predate it. They eventually become known for communal living. They have these their communities are governed by councils of men and women kind of working together. They become really well known for their kind of distinctive furniture, architecture, craftsmanship traditions. They have a really unique musical tradition. Their peak is in like the mid 19th century, where they have a few thousand members at, I think, give or take, like almost 20 communities throughout the US.
Oh, wow.
But then they kind of go into decline for various reasons. In the early 20th century, you start to get the gradual closure of different villages or communities. And today there's one community left, as I mentioned, Sabbath Day Lake in Maine, which has 2 Shakers, although I think only one of them actually lives in the community. The other, I think, is in a nursing home, the last I heard.
Oh my gosh.
So,
it's crazy.
I can't help but be surprised, and I hope I'm not disrespectful saying this, but when somebody goes and says, for some reason, this group that proclaims celibacy is in decline and not growing.
Fair enough.
It's I think,
I mean, there's kind of an obvious demographic reason in some ways, but it's interesting because for a long time they were able to sustain themselves almost entirely based on converts, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's also, through kind of the early 20th century, it's really interesting, a number of Shaker communities actually adopted orphans. So this is before like the US foster care, like before like adoption and foster care and all the things that we have today. And back when you had like actual orphanages in the US, right?
Right.
And so it was actually like relatively common for Shaker communities to adopt children and raise them, but without the expectation that they would necessarily stay as adults. So there's actually like a decent sized cohort of a certain time period of people who are raised as Shakers but leave as adults and have a variety of different relationships to that experience, right? Sometime in the early 20th century, though, and I don't really know the full history of this, but presumably somebody goes, yeah, we're actually not going to let communes adopt random kids anymore.
Okay.
Right, but like a lot of things shift around how people think about what should happen if a child doesn't have caregivers and things like that. So that is kind of one factor. But I mean, yeah, like on the one hand, it's like, gee, I wonder why. But on the other hand, like they did manage to keep it going for a long time.
Yeah.
And I know that they're not the only religious group with an idea like this. Oh my gosh, sorry, my cat is being nuts. I think she saw a lizard out the window.
No problem.
Nothing is more exciting than a lizard out the window if you're my cat.
Or my kids.
Oh, okay. I mean,
Yeah.
they're not wrong.
No.
I got distracted by the lizard. I'm sorry.
No, that's all good.
What was I saying? Oh, so I mean, Shakers also have this idea that, and this is like a prophecy that was attributed to Ann Lee, was that at some point there would be, you know, a very small number of Shakers, but then the movement would like expand again.
Okay.
So who knows, man?
Yeah. Well, you touched on a lot of things there that I think are interesting.
Yeah, you go a lot of directions. Sorry, I was trying to do like the short version.
No, that was great. It was great. Thank you.
Okay.
The first thing that I think is interesting. What were the meetings called? The Quakers did. What were they called? The no.
Oh, I mean the term that people use today is an unprogrammed meeting. I don't know that was like in use at the time.
Okay.
But today that's and that's used today to distinguish from what they call a programmed meeting, which again is a service that looks more like various Protestant churches.
Okay. Well, that strikes me as important because, well, that and the fact that, you know, Ann Lee's illiteracy speaks to the fact that this was a very, very democratic group. Is that
in many ways, yeah.
Yeah. Like you said, there's no leadership, right?
So that was with the Quakers. Shakers kind of acquire some leadership.
Okay.
Yes,
yeah, I mean, you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean, Quaker congregations usually have like a secretary, but the Shakers, by the time they become their own thing, and especially with Shaker communities, there are leaders of the community, but it's not usually like one person. It was a council made up of men and women. Shakers, like Quakers before then, had strong beliefs about the equality of men and women. And so it was usually kind of run by a council, although again, with smaller numbers today, I'm sure that's a little different. But no, like they did have leadership of the communities, especially once you move to communal living rather than just, oh, this is like a church congregation, but like these are people who live together.
Right. Yeah. And I think, and I think that you mentioned there was, I read about somebody who was the leader of the Shaker congregation that Copley was involved with.
Right.
Who was kind of put off by Copley after a while. But anyway, yeah.
After they delivered the message, yeah.
Yeah. Ashbel Kitchell was his name. But yeah, we'll get into that.
Good name.
Yeah, it is a good name. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about Ann Lee. You mentioned they do have some leadership. We know that they had some congressional leadership, and you know, our podcast is about the story of Mormonism, and so we're used to talking about the organization as a prophet, right? A higher up who kind of leads the whole church. He's got a title, prophet, president. He writes scripture. He delivers revelation. He kind of has the last and final say on everything. Compare that to Ann Lee's role with the Shakers, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing I think that's an interesting contrast is that Ann Lee doesn't really pass on her role after she dies in the same way that, you know, a new prophet is selected. More importantly, though, so Ann Lee, I mean, the fundamental thing that people usually know about her is that Shakers saw her as kind of this second appearing, because the name, right, the United Society of Believers in Christ Second Appearing, they believe that second appearing took place in Ann Lee.
Okay.
You look at it's a little complicated, so I get a little finicky about this because I'm obnoxious and pedantic. So
you'll
occasionally hear people say, like, oh, they believe that Anne Lee was the second coming of Christ. I'm like, well, kind of. So really, it's interesting too, because it's generally agreed that she never made that claim during her lifetime.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you about
She didn't say, she did claim to have this kind of mystical relationship with Jesus that later became kind of interpreted in that light. But basically she becomes regarded in Shaker thought as this kind of female counterpart to Jesus, and that they both kind of composed Christ in some capacity. And this is in part because they have still today, right? Shaker theology has like a very, you'll occasionally see people use the word like dualist kind of idea about God, that God doesn't have a traditional, human gender, but that God encompasses both kind of male and female. And so that if God encompasses those, and if Jesus was a man, then there had to eventually be a female counterpart. But it's not, there's not any teaching about, I think sometimes people assume because of this, second coming phrasing, that people thought she, similarly was born miraculously or things like that. Shaker theology sees both her and Jesus rather as people who kind of attained the office of Christ, if that makes sense, rather than people who were born and that was going to be the path the whole time. Again, if that made any sense. But basically, so she's seen as this, she's referred to by Shakers historically and today as Mother Anne, is kind of her title within the group. But yeah, she doesn't pass on that status. Instead, you get these leadership councils within various communities. Historically, there are definitely like specific people you can point to where it's like, oh, this person was actually like very influential for the Shakers at large, but you don't have the same level of kind of singular leadership that existed during her lifetime, or the kind of status that she's accorded, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when I read the introduction of this section in Doctrine and Covenants, it makes it pretty clear that Christ's second coming has occurred and that he appeared in the form of Anne Lee. And so, and I hear you saying that's not, she never claimed that. Obviously,
but later Shakers kind of accorded her that status. But
so do you think
I kind of see that description as like almost like a Mormon, or even just like more mainstream Christian translation of that understanding?
Okay.
Right. If you have this idea about how Jesus, is going to come like a second coming, it makes sense that you would just articulate it that way, right?
Okay.
Is kind of how I see it, if that's what you were asking.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Is that more of an outsider's view of it, or more of an insider's perspective?
A little bit more of an outsider one, I think.
Did
but
she
again,
develop...
like, some of that is just me being pedantic. So.
Oh, that's...
Sorry, what were you saying, John?
Good. Yeah, sorry. So was she referred to as that role during her lifetime, or did it come after she had passed away?
My general understanding is that it's after she passed away. So yeah, I mean, during her lifetime, she herself never makes that claim, is my understanding. But later, after she's passed away, that kind of gets accorded to her. Although, like I said, she did kind of articulate herself as having kind of this, again, like very kind of mystical relationship with Jesus that later gets interpreted by later Shakers as part of this, duality of, man and woman, Jesus and Anne Lee.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because you have so much going on there with theology.
There's a lot happening.
Gender.
Yeah.
So Tyler mentioned this in section 49, verse 22 says, "And again, verily I say unto you that the Son of Man cometh not in the form of a woman, neither of a man traveling on the earth." So it sounds, after hearing your explanation, and Tyler kind of alluded to this too, this is kind of a misleading interpretation of, well, in a way, it's like you said, maybe Joseph Smith at the time kind of interpreted Anne Lee's role, or self-proclaimed role, as Christ, and so this is sort of a correction of that, right?
Right. I mean, so by this point, again, like some of the stuff around like, well, she kind of attained a status. I mean,
Right.
I think to most people who hear that, it's gonna get right. We funnel ideas into the categories we have, right? So I can absolutely see why someone would say like, okay, so she's the second coming of Christ, because like that's basically correct. Again, I'm just
Right.
being pedantic. I'm sorry.
No,
I care
that's
too
good.
much about Shakers, which is why I'm here.
Understandable. I think it's fair to say most people in America have an inexplicable passion for the Shaker community. So
Yeah,
I
we
think
all
Yes.
love Shakers.
many
Yeah.
can
We
relate.
all love
Many can
Shakers.
relate.
Yes.
Maybe I'll try to say my words just to make sure that I understand what you're saying, and that is that a Shaker may put this Ann Lee at the same level of Christ, almost by a title or maybe responsibilities, role perhaps, but not as
Mhm.
not as the same literal being, but the same
Right, as a counterpart.
as kind of like the same level
Right.
or something like that. Whereas potentially in the reading of Doctrine and Covenants, the perception is that it's the second coming is that the Shakers believe that the second coming was this Ann Lee coming as Jesus Christ.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think no, that's actually a pretty good articulation of it. Yeah.
All right.
I think, like I said,
Good
the
job,
difference
Tyler.
for Shakers, I think, comes into the separation of Jesus and Christ, right? That they saw Christ, if God encompasses duality, that Christ had to in some capacity, and they kind of separate Christ and Jesus and say, like, well, yeah, Jesus is Christ, but also so is Ann Lee. But I could absolutely see how, again, if you don't have a pedantic weirdo going into it, that you'd be like, oh, okay, so she was the second coming of Jesus. And it's like, well, not quite. But again, like I can absolutely see why someone would interpret it that way.
Interesting.
Cool. Appreciate the explanation.
Oh yeah.
So-
Sorry, I feel like I've spent way too much of people's time.
No, this is we're asking the
Okay.
questions here, so
Okay.
you're fine.
Okay.
I do think this is fascinating. So talk to us maybe a little bit about gender. So
Sure.
Ann Lee had to be unique in this, right? She's a woman leading a religious organization, essentially on two different continents. She starts in Great Britain, like as you mentioned,
Right.
and comes to the U.S. There's a lot here that I want to talk about, but maybe you could just start by saying or telling us a little bit about how she was viewed nationally here in the U.S. during that time.
Kind of depended. Either as
Right.
if you're someone who became a Shaker, or in some ways, if you're like Lehman Copley and you're in accord with the Shakers on some things, even if you don't go live in a community with them. She's kind of seen as this visionary figure, and it's worth remembering too. Most people who joined the Shakers never met Ann Lee. She was gone by that time. She existed in the form of song and teaching and things like that. But when she was alive, what we do know is that, kind of like in England, she actually like made a lot of people very upset.
Right.
She also, among other things, I mean, this is an era where most Protestants have very specific ideas about women preaching, namely that they should not be doing it. Although we could talk about some other women from this time period who were also preaching. There was also, because she had this kind of ecstatic and intense style of preaching and worship, people would often accuse her of being drunk.
Oh, wow.
Like that was actually really common. And that's actually an accusation you occasionally read about later in the 19th century, that people will say like, oh, Shakers are actually just drunk all the time, which there's not really evidence for. But so, yeah, I mean, it kind of, in some ways, the response in D&C 49 is pretty typical for non-Shakers of the era, kind of just seeing them as like diluted a little bit. But it's interesting too, because especially during the 19th century, Shakers were actually kind of seen as like a little, like, not just like, oh, they're not correct, but like that they were kind of dangerous. People got really anxious about, especially like women leaving their families to go be a Shaker, right? Or people, otherwise kind of disrupting their familial relationships to go join this new family. And so it is kind of funny that like today they're almost seen as like, as American as outright, that people are like, oh, the Shakers, chairs, communal living, wholesomeness, right? And it's like, yeah, no, in the 19th century, a lot of people thought that they were like dangerous and scary to a certain degree.
Wow.
So
yes, very radical and interesting.
yeah. And yeah, so like I said, it's a little complicated because yeah, most people who became Shakers, communal living as a Shaker idea even really doesn't come about until after she's gone. Right? She's really only in the US for about a decade, and they don't really take off until after she passes away.
Wow.
So.
Was that fear based prominently because it was living on a commune, or was there other beliefs that people found threatening or dangerous?
So I think a lot of it for people, especially during that era, was the idea that you were kind of severing your existing familial relationships.
So just
because,
isolation of communal
living. So if you were like, let's say that you're a married couple with a few kids and you meet Shakers, you decide that you're going to become Shakers. When you enter the Shaker community, you're no longer married in any meaningful sense. You are brother and sister like everyone else. Your children may or may not be fully raised by you. They might be raised a little more communally. And so especially if somebody left, especially in situations where it wasn't like a full family joining, but like someone in a family, right? Like let's say a wife and a mother being like, I'm going to go be a Shaker now, bye. That was seen as like really scary to people. That there was like something that was seen as not just like very upsetting and unnatural, right? During this time period, especially when you have this valorization of kind of domestic womanhood, especially for white women, right? This idea that you were, around the hearth and you're taking care of your children. And this is kind of what women are supposed to be doing. For you to be like, peace out, I'm going to go live on a commune where everyone's my brother and sister is like kind of terrifying to some people. And like, that's definitely exacerbated by various beliefs and practices that people also found strange or unusual, right? But like the core of it is often this idea that you're like rejecting your familial role. And in some cases, like, especially for women, that you're rejecting what you're supposed to be doing as a woman.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that. Like anything, I get the sense that anything that sort of encouraged women to kind of step outside, step outside that role, was perceived as dangerous and radical and shouldn't be done. Is that fair to say?
I mean, there's always going to be variation among, but I mean, generally that was in many cases a significant component of people being freaked out about Shakers. And I mean, I mentioned that they had this conception of gender equality. It's interesting though. They still definitely had ideas of men and women being like distinctive from each other. Like it's worth noting that during this era, I mean, most work in Shaker communities, right? Because you got to do stuff to make the community operate. Kind of fell along like traditionally gendered lines for that era, right? So men are doing farm work and doing stuff outside. The women are weaving, cooking, tending the children. So yeah, it's I think there's this assumption that like it was some kind of free for all. But no, they still had like pretty specific ideas about gender roles. They just happen to be a little less specific and restrictive than broader societal ones. Okay. If that makes any sense. Okay.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you have like the national, like you said, we're working in generalizations here. You have the sort of national perception of how women should behave, what they should be doing. Shakers kind of turn that on its head, but not completely.
Right. There are still expectations.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So we've touched on sort of the communal life of a Shaker a little bit. Like you said, there's gender roles. There's sort of communal raising of children to an extent. Can you tell us a little bit more about what life was like in the Shaker commune?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of work, right? Especially like seriously, right? This is an era where there's not a lot of the labor saving devices that we take for granted today. Although it's worth noting, Shakers were often like at the forefront of adopting various technologies. They were like all aboard with getting electricity, for example. But they also had this attitude. You'll occasionally see the phrase "hands to work and hearts to God." I mean, part of the reason for communal living was this idea that everything you do could be kind of part of a life that worshiped God, right? Whether you were at a religious service or you were singing or you were making a chair, that was something that could be equally kind of consecrated in some way, right? That could be equally holy. And so, yeah, there's a lot of work happening because again, you got to make stuff happen, but it was really kind of sanctified in a very specific way.
Interesting.
Men and women lived separately. You'll occasionally see in like Shaker meeting houses, if you visit a Shaker village today, some of the larger buildings where people would gather would actually have like separate entrances for men and women. They would usually sit separately. Some of them also have like separate staircases. And some of this is around this idea that like, in order to maintain celibacy, like you have to have a little bit of, there's this assumption that people are not naturally inclined to celibacy, right? And so you have to have a little bit of physical distance to kind of reinforce that. Sorry, I'm going to carry this over with me real quick because my cat, I think, is going to be real mad if I don't let her out the door, and then she'll want to come back in 10 seconds. But, you know.
No problem.
Okay. I'm like, everyone just gets a weird panorama of my room. Sorry. Or the room that I'm commandeering for this. Anyway, sorry about that.
No problem.
Again, she'll be back in like 2 seconds. I'm just like, whatever, cat. Sorry.
So, no, that's all right. That's all good. So how, to what extent was there separation between genders in the communes? You mentioned that they would worship separately, you know, like separate.
So they were in the same, yeah. I mean, a lot of it was kind of, again, just kind of like a physical separation, but they were still doing all, you know, working like, alongside each other.
Oh, okay. So they saw each other and interacted.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. You just get, in some cases, kind of this interesting way that's like built into the, even just like the architecture, right?
Yeah. Wow.
But yeah.
So, and just to clarify, when you mentioned Shaker villages, we're talking like reenactments, right? Because you also said there's two Shakers.
Oh, left. I mean, so yeah, when I say Shaker villages, they're usually preserved as historic sites.
Right.
There's not usually like reenactors, I think, at most of them, but you can like visit a lot of them and like tour the buildings, you know, see various things. There's lots of there's actually like a very big market for like Shaker furniture and things like that. Cool. So yeah, if you visit one of them, they're kind of just operating as historic sites, unless you go to Sabbath Day Lake. So
okay. All right. So there's two things that I want to talk about now that you brought up. The first is ties into a verse in section 49, verse 20. It says, "But it is not given that one man should possess that which is above another, wherefore the world lieth in sin." So at this point, so at this point, Mormons are experimenting or starting to get into this idea of communal living, right? We know Lehman Copley, for example, had people living on his farm who had converted to the church. I think they were the Colesville.
And then didn't he like kind of go back on it, and that caused a lot of drama?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But so the Mormons are kind of experimenting with that.
How things like the United Order and like.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So with the Shakers, how did they view property and possessions? Was it sort of along the same lines as Mormons would come to look at it, or was it different?
So my understanding is you basically, Shakers, like a lot of other communal movements, I think would have distinguished between like something like the buildings that everyone lived in, or let's say that you came into the community with some money and you gave that to the community, versus like your toothbrush, right? Your toothbrush belongs to you. Nobody wants to communally own your toothbrush or your clothing or anything like that. But like everything else would be kind of considered to belong to the community, is my understanding. So yeah, I've always been a little kind of like, oh, here's my cat. Mildly puzzled by that verse, I think, because I'm like, I don't.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, largely communal, and especially like I said, if you came into a community, the expectation was that anything, in terms of wealth or property or other things that you had would become part of the community's
Interesting.
general assets.
Yeah. So it seems like section 20 or 49 is almost listing off like these things. Shakers aren't quite right about this. They're wrong about that.
Maybe
they have,
yes.
Yeah, but maybe they have a point here with property.
Maybe I don't know.
Is that a fair to say, or all right?
Yeah, I don't
Anyway,
really know how.
so,
I've always been a little confused by that one in context. I don't know.
Okay, interesting. Great.
And
then,
and Alex, John. First off, John, I apologize for asking the question without your permission before. It will not happen again. Alex, may I ask you a question?
Yes.
Thank you, Alex. I just won't ask John if permission anymore. No. So this revelation was given in 1831, which is obviously really shortly after the organization of the church. Do we know if this was done in an attempt to convert them to Joseph Smith's church, or just a way for Joseph Smith to? Do we know any of the motive behind this?
I think it's kind of a little of column A, a little of column B, and that some of it I think is definitely Lehman Copley being told off, because the kind of intro and some of the context that's usually provided is that like he maybe was still clinging to some Shaker beliefs despite getting involved with the church. And so my sense has always been it's like partially Lehman Copley being told like knock it off. But also like he and Sidney Rigdon and Parley Pratt are sent to like deliver this message to the Shakers, and they do go, and it's interesting. Like my sense is they kind of took advantage of like Shaker meetings, like Quaker meetings, were very spontaneous, right? There's a lot of kind of like song and dance and stuff, but there was also, you could kind of just be like, I'm going to talk now, right? And so my sense they kind of took advantage of that, and they were like, we would like to read a message to you. And the Shakers were like, no, thank you. Thank you for sharing, but no thanks, but no thanks, basically. And then it's interesting too, because prior to this, like the Shakers had been pretty chill with the church. They would, do various, kind of business stuff. They would trade things and things like that. And this seems to have kind of soured the relationship, was my impression, from what I've read. So I think it was like partially telling Lehman Copley, like, you need to abandon some of these beliefs, but then also, going and telling the Shakers like, hey, you guys, we think you're wrong. But again, it doesn't seem to have landed in that second purpose.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
From what I know.
Yeah. From what I understand, Oliver Cowdery and I think Sidney Rigdon were the first to kind of introduce the church to this. I think they were called the North Union branch or parish.
Yeah, I'm like, I'd have to look at a map.
Yeah.
Well, strength in geography.
Yeah. Well, in any case, Cowdery and Rigdon come to this branch of the Shakers, this community, and they preach. And Cowdery actually establishes a pretty good relationship with Kitchell, and asks if they can leave some Book of Mormons with him, and that in part leads to Lehman Copley's.
Right.
I went for like,
and all of this is like much later. Yeah.
Yeah. So that leads to his sort of conversion. And then later on, Rigdon, Copley, and Parley P. Pratt go. And, Parley Pratt he's pretty fiery guy, comes in and says, hey, we have this message we'd like to share, and reads the revelation, and they're turned away, like you said. and I want to say like
Doesn't
Parley Pratt.
Parley Pratt do something dramatic like shake the dust off his
Yep.
coattails or something?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And that like pisses the Shakers off.
Yep. Yeah. So from what I read, Rigdon read the
drama.
revelation and he was like, okay, that's he didn't want to read it, but Parley kind of made him read it.
He was
And
like, I'm fulfilling my I'm just the messenger, don't shoot me.
Exactly. Yeah. And then Parley comes in, is like, no, not so fast. Listen, we're here to convert you people, essentially. and I think Kitchell actually said that Parley Pratt rose, shook the dust from his coattail as a testimony against us that we had rejected the word of the Lord Jesus. So anyway.
Again, Parley's got a sense of drama. I appreciate it. I respect it.
Yeah. So that was kind of the story there, I think. But yeah, you're absolutely right in that it seems like this revelation was to correct some of Copley's beliefs from the view of the LDS, right? But then also give them something to take to the Shakers. Do you think that there was sort of this eagerness to talk to the Shakers because of sort of their shared belief in the millennial movement?
Maybe, I don't know. It's interesting because I've thought about the fact before that it's like, is there an alternate universe where there's a D&C 49 about like a different, where, you know, they're visiting the Oneida community or something,
right? Yeah.
How much of it was just that this was another religious group seen by outsiders as kind of unusual and new and things like that.
And maybe it's a geography thing too, just because there was a community.
And again, this kind of specific role of Lehman Copley where, you know, especially because he has all this farmland, he kind of becomes an important piece of things and that he has a useful resource, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Cause it's like, if you don't have someone like him who kind of crosses sides, so to speak, do you get something like this? And I don't know that you do. I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. And then another verse that I wanted to touch on here is in 15, verse 15 of this section.
Right.
Let me get there. It says, "And again, verily I say unto you that whoso forbiddeth to marry is not ordained of God, for marriage is ordained of God unto man." Now we've touched on this repeatedly throughout the podcast, the idea of celibacy, right? So the revelation here is stating that the Shakers have this wrong, right? That marriage is ordained of God and people should be married. So maybe you could tell us about the Shaker belief in celibacy, like.
Sure.
Yeah, jump in.
I'm already there. So, yeah, I mean, that is kind of an interest again in the litany of, think of it as like a litany of grievances. It's like, and another thing.
Right.
So yeah, so Shaker, like I said, this is a thing that's generally kind of regarded to have been initially taught by Anne Lee, that was kind of one of her contributions as it became kind of a separate group from the broader Quaker universe. And there's like a few different kind of aspects to it. I mean, a big part of it is this identification of sexuality with what, you know, Adam and Eve getting cast out of the garden, right? And so she basically is like, well, it's obviously from her perspective, right? Like that means that this is obviously like not a good thing. And especially if you know, are coming from the perspective of things like original sin and, you know, very different perspective about getting cast out of the garden than the LDS tradition, right?
Right. And she was married, right? Like early on.
That's kind of an interesting, So, and just, I mean, as an addition to that, I mean, there's also some elements of kind of attempting to imitate what they believe to be Jesus's celibacy, general rejection of all sin. But so I mean, it like a lot of religious movements, right? This is something that kind of evolves over time. Anne Lee was, as you said, she was married, and he actually came over from England initially. It's interesting, because like she was married. There were a number of early Shakers who were married, and it's more once they become an established movement that it really is emphasized, like you can't do that, right? Or if you've already done it, you're not doing it anymore. Like I said, you would no,
Right.
but like you'd see these stories of families who would kind of enter the community, and I mean, it's not like anyone like went and got a divorce technically or anything, but it was like you were no longer married in any meaningful sense. Yeah, so this is one of the other interesting things, kind of turning toward how people have studied Anne Lee and the Shaker tradition. You'll occasionally get people arguing, and I don't like this, and we can talk about it maybe. You'll see people arguing that Anne Lee's shift towards celibacy was actually about the fact that, as far as we know, and I don't remember the exact sourcing on this, I think it comes more out of like Shaker kind of oral tradition to a certain extent, that she had multiple miscarriages that were like fairly traumatic. And so you'll occasionally see people say like, well, obviously like her attitude about celibacy came from, these experiences that she had. And
Right.
it's not
Kind
to
of
say that like
justifying
nobody's,
it. Yeah.
well, and like I just feel weird about, I don't know, it's not that nobody's experiences impact them, right? But it's I always read it as a little dismissive. I'm always much more interested in like why does someone kind of come to this really strong belief, right? And she did like identify multiple, from her perspective, like religious reasons for celibacy, right?
It wasn't a purely emotional
right.
thing
I
that
think
she built on,
I get kind of weirded out by people kind of implying that like, oh, it was actually just that, she was upset. I'm like, well, she probably was upset, but like that doesn't necessarily negate that she was also someone who is like creating this new religious tradition and like pulling from all these different influences that she had, both in terms of practical experience and theology. So again, it's not that that's irrelevant, but there are sometimes you'll see people kind of reduce it to that, and I don't know that I like that.
Yeah. It does. I think it would kind of discredit her,
I don't know,
her reasoning and her movement. Yeah.
Could you help me put the pieces together? So the Shakers is kind of spins off from the Quakers, correct?
Yes.
And
it doesn't help that they rhyme. It gets a little confusing.
That does not. And then, maybe that's why I'm so confused.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah. And so, but the Quakers, they also practice celibacy to a large extent. Is that correct? Oh, they don't at all. That's more of a Shaker thing.
That's purely Shaker. Yeah. Anne Lee
that's where I was confused.
You're good. You're good. Like I said, it does not help that they rhyme.
All right.
And it also doesn't help that, like, for most people, Quakers are like the guy on the oatmeal box.
Oatmeal. Yep.
They don't.
And Shakers are
they
the
don't
ones
have
with
as much
stairs,
PR.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's not. It's you're good. They rhyme. It's confusing. You're good.
Not as much PR. Yeah. So, what were we talking about? Anne Lee. Yeah. So the idea of celibacy, I think, is
right.
So you have other groups doing this at the same time, right? So you have the Shakers who are practicing celibacy post marriage. In fact, just did away with marriage. It sounds like.
Right.
You have Mormons who would come to embrace polygamy in the next, 13, 14 years. But what other, and you had other communities doing different things with, chastity, marriage, that sort of thing, right?
The kind of classic trio, and there are like multiple books and other things that kind of put them together, is like Shakers, Mormons, Oneida community. Because they all kind of erupt in roughly the same time period. They all kind of have this relationship.
In different levels.
Although, again, the Shaker relationship's a little weird because they more like expand during that period, but they don't originate during that period. But anyway, but yeah, so as you said, like Shakers reject marriage altogether. Mormons start experimenting with various things. The Oneida community, I could be here. They could have their own separate podcast episodes. I'm trying to be brief. Their kind of calling card in that regard was that they practiced what they called complex marriage, which was this belief that everyone in the community was married to everyone else.
Wow.
And how that played out was complex. Because occasionally I'll be talking about that, and my students are like, so is everyone just like running around? And I'm like, no. It's always fun to try to keep it PG when I'm talking about the Oneida community.
Yeah.
But so they were saying, It's interesting though, because it's like it wasn't, that didn't necessarily mean that you could go have marital relations with whoever you wanted.
Okay. That's a good
There
way to
was
put it.
especially, there was a lot of kind of consciousness around who was having children. One of their, again, we could be for the next like 16 years talking about this, but one of their beliefs was that spirituality or like spiritual status, so like if you were someone who was particularly holy in some capacity, that could be passed down like to your children. And so they practiced the term they used, they loved coming up with terms, the Oneida community, bless them, was stirpiculture, which was their term for basically like trying to selectively have more spiritually evolved children, basically. And so the community, a council of elders within the community chose who was going to have kids with who. The founder of the community, John Humphrey Noyes, there were roughly like 50 children born under this system, and he fathered like 10 of them. So he clearly had a very high opinion of his spirituality. But yeah, so like they're doing it. It's kind of funny because I think of it as like the Shakers are like, no thanks. The Mormons are like, well, let's maybe complicate things a little. In the United community is just like, woo, like just doing a totally different. They're not even playing the same, like they're not even playing baseball anymore. They're playing. They're not even playing
Quidditch.
cricket. Like they're on the moon. Like something very different is happening. So
that's interesting, and hopefully I don't go too deep into this, but one of the big criticisms of organizations that practice polygamy is kind of the male power position. And so it's interesting to me that the Oneida community has Noyce, who you mentioned has a lot of posterity. And in the Mormon history, obviously high-ranking church leaders have a lot of posterity. And then in the Shakers, with the lady in charge, they choose for celibacy.
There's no children. Well,
with Ann Lee, excuse me. I'll use her name. Yeah.
No, it is.
It's interesting putting those two pieces together, even though I don't know if I'm generalizing way too far on that.
No, you're good. Yeah, I mean, another kind of interesting wrinkle with stuff with the Oneida community was they were, in addition to this kind of, selectively having more spiritual children thing, they were really conscious about basically like Noyes was very worried about like the burden that pregnancy placed on women. He believed that sex was this like gift from God that everyone should be able to enjoy. And so he believed that like the potential to get pregnant, like significantly impacted one person more than the other, shall we say, right? Yeah. So part of, again, keeping it relatively PG, part of the Oneida community's kind of general teachings and ethos was what you might think of as like experiments with birth control, basically.
Wow.
So it's interesting because in some ways you can kind of see it as like there was kind of this interesting consciousness around like who's having children and like what does that mean. I don't know, it's complicated. Again, the United community is they're doing a lot. A lot happening.
So I'm wondering if you could take a bird's eye view of this. We've mentioned the Shakers, Mormons, Oneida community. I know there were others like what's her name, Jemima Wilkinson or Wilkins?
Yeah, the Public Universal Friend.
Yeah, who's completely genderless, right?
Yeah, adopts this genderless role. Yeah.
So what's going on at this time that would sort of encourage these very different types of traditional gender roles and marital relations, we'll call it? Can you say anything about that? Like what do you think is happening?
There's a lot happening. I feel
that's such a big question.
No, you're good. I feel like this entire interview is just me going, there's a lot happening.
Yeah.
I'm so articulate. I mean, there are a few things, right? One is this kind of outgrowth of the Second Great Awakening where you didn't necessarily have women in the more, I guess you might say, kind of mainstream Protestant Second Great Awakening spaces. It's not that they were suddenly just kind of doing whatever, but there was kind of this expansion of what women could do in those spaces, right? They could kind of participate in having these strong emotional reactions to the service. They could potentially pray over other people, right? So there is kind of this expansion happening. just not necessarily to the same degree as you see with like the Shakers or the United community, right? There's also, I mean, this is a period where people's ideas about like marriage and family kind of are a little bit in flux. Again, really, really generalizing and talking about a change that occurs over a vast period of time. But you kind of get this shift from marriage being it's not that you shouldn't like the person that you're getting married to, but like the idea that romantic love is your primary consideration at one point in history is like kind of bonkers to people. Like that seems like being a little silly.
Yeah.
And like hopefully like it's nice if you love them, but like that's not the main thing you're thinking about when you choose to get who to get married to, frankly.
Right.
And then you eventually get the shift toward that being like the primary factor for who you should marry, right? You also get this kind of elevation of the nuclear family, in part because of various advances that mean that you need less labor to run your household, right? We were kind of talking about some of that earlier. If you need a lot of work to be done like manually, it helps if you have a bunch of people that you're living with, right? If you're living with extended family in some capacity. And again, these are like a slow shift in a lot of this stuff, right? We talk about kind of what's seen as the ideal, and that might not necessarily reflect everybody's reality, but it was seen as the ideal. And some of this stuff is a little more along that continuum. But I mean, in some ways, like I said, you can kind of see some of this as kind of very, very far ends of some of these, for most people, like much smaller changes or kind of possibilities of change that are coming up during this period.
Interesting.
Ish.
Yeah. Cool. Well, two things. The first thing is, so we focused on section 49. What would you say as a historian? I know like historian is pretty broad. I'm using it as a very broad term, right?
Okay.
I know you're like a religious studies.
It's okay.
Specialist.
Just don't tell the historians that you called me a historian. They're territorial. I respect it.
Yeah. What would you say is sort of the lasting legacy of this section in D&C?
Oh boy. I think to me it's this really fascinating window into this interaction between two groups that were seen as kind of unusual and new by many around them. And I think it's interesting to kind of get this Mormon perspective on Shakers, like from the LDS or Mormon standpoint, right? And it's interesting because you can see some ways that their critiques overlapped with kind of these, again, broader societal upset about various elements of Shaker teaching. But then you also kind of see some stuff maybe get a little more focused on or like articulated in specific ways. And also because of like the specific community that they're talking to. I think one thing we didn't get into was there's a few verses talking about meat. And that's because this specific Shaker community at this specific time was kind of more experimenting with vegetarianism, but that was never like a core, as far as I've been able to find out, like that was never like a core Shaker teaching for all Shakers. And so it's a little interesting to see that becomes like something that's like discusses another thing that, you know, Shakers are seen as doing wrong. But it's because they're interacting with this very specific community, right? There was like a lot of uniformity to these different Shaker communities, but they're also different communities in different places. People are going to do stuff differently. So again, I mostly see it as this kind of really interesting window into kind of two, at the time, kind of small up and coming religious groups' perceptions of each other. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's I think what I like about it too is that you have these two very unique movements happening at a very unique time, and this is sort of this is a great case study in what's happening overall. And then when those two forces collide, I mean, at first they get along with each other, and then Parley Pratt waves his coattails at him, and we should have spent more time on Parley Pratt flapping his coattails. Because just the image of that,
the drama.
If someone flaps your coattails at you, how could you not be offended? You're turning around and doing this little, like
I picture it's like a 19th century dab, like he's just like,
and it's like, oh, he did not. Did you just see what he did? You know.
Well, again,
definitely
the
should have spent
figure of
more time
Lehman.
on that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It's just we definitely should have spent more time on that.
I think we just did, John.
Yeah,
I think we just did. But that was great imagery.
Way more. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, I think also like Lehman Copley is really interesting because he is this example of, I mean, there was occasionally like kind of migration between these groups, so to speak, right? You did have people like Lehman Copley, like, right? It's not just people from more quote unquote mainstream religious backgrounds that are joining the LDS movement. It's also people who are, you know, sort of Shakers, like Lehman Copley. And the reason I say sort of Shakers, I think we didn't really talk about this. He didn't live in the community,
right,
and he stayed married. But like you kind of talked about it, I think the very beginning of the episode, right? A lot of religious movements have, you know, varying levels of engagement. Sorry, my cat is doing things again. I hope listeners enjoy hearing my cat do things.
Everybody loves cats.
I don't know if we like hearing them chase him like a toy though. That's not as exciting.
The YouTube numbers disagree.
But yeah,
love.
Yes,
it's true. It's true. Cat videos,
right? But so yes, like Lehman Copley is someone who is kind of on this marginal Shaker status because, like, again, like the Shaker ideal was that you would come join this community, you would not be married, but like there were going to be people who were like interested, but like didn't fully adopt that or things like that.
Yeah.
So I think he's also an interesting example because, like, yeah, there was like people going between and among these various groups, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he was a guy who definitely like couldn't quite commit to the Shakers and then
couldn't quite commit.
Couldn't quite commit to the Mormons. Like, how long are these people going to be on my farm? You know, and then I know after a little while he left the church. He was brought back in, but then he left again and joined a few other churches. Seemed like a guy who liked to dabble. You know, I think I'll just dabble.
There's always been people.
Check it out.
Yeah, I think that he's also interesting in that he's an example of. I feel like, especially kind of in that early period, there was a lot more kind of almost volatility of stuff like that you would be disfellowshipped and then you get rebaptized, and that like that was just a thing that happened. Whereas I feel like today, if someone gets disfellowshipped, that's seen as like a lot more serious.
Yeah,
and like it's just not as common. Whereas I feel like sometimes reading early church history, the people were just kind of doing all kinds of things in that regard in a way that doesn't quite happen today. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's one last piece. I was wondering if you guys were going to throw it in there, and since we're nearing the end, I will bring it up myself. And this is for the conspiracy theorists out there.
Once again, Tyler bringing everything to a screeching halt. But
data is data, and this is another data point for. I will let everyone decide. So in verse 23, he says, looking forth for the heavens to be shaken. So is it possible, conspiracy theorists only, is it possible that Joseph Smith is promoting Shakers in this because the heavens are going to be shaken?
A secret pro-Shaker message.
I'm just lobbing it out. Whoever wants to take that, take it and run with it, because it's a data point.
It's a good starting point. I'm looking.
I saw it as I saw it as sort of him throwing them a bone. Here you go.
He's like,
the
heavens will be
there you go.
Yeah. the heavens.
Yeah, I kind of like picturing Sidney Rigdon or whoever being like,
there you
like
go.
Wordplay.
See what we did?
John pictures how he gets his coat tail and flaps it. I picture how he emphasized the word shaken, and the heavens will be shaken. Wink, wink. Wink, wink.
And that's when they decided they weren't feeling this message. They were like,
and the earth shall tremble, blah 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 blah. And
it's like you said, they didn't appreciate the term Shakers. Yeah. All right. Now you're just teasing us. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, they're like it's disrespectful. We feel mocked.
Yeah.
It's possibly like the church today, where some Mormons don't mind the term Mormon, but officially that's an offensive.
Right.
So. Who knows?
Yeah.
Again, this isn't for your scientists and academics out there. I'm targeting a different audience, throwing that out. So I'm
Thanks.
sure we
Someone's
have.
got to target to
Yeah.
the conspiracy theorists. So.
Yeah,
Yeah.
roll with it. I want to hear the feedback.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying.
excited. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Email us, Instagram, YouTube, wherever you want to reach out to us. Let's hear what you got.
Yeah. Okay. Last thing, Alex. We think of ourselves on this show, Tyler and I. We like to think of ourselves as boosters in some way. Like when you come on, we're embracing you. We're taking you under our wing, so to speak.
Yes.
So maybe you could throw out to our listeners, all the half dozen of them out there, what you're working on right now. What can we look forward to from you?
Sure. I am working on basically an adaptation / revision of my dissertation to hopefully be a book at some point in some capacity. So my dissertation was on a man named Patrick Healy, who was a Jesuit priest in the 19th century. He lived from, I think, 1834 to 1910. Although as soon as I say that, I'm questioning myself. But I'm like, did he? Anyway, he and his family, he and his siblings are really interesting. A number of them attained kind of noteworthy positions in the Catholic Church. So Patrick was at one point president of Georgetown University, which of course is run by Jesuits. His older brother James was the Bishop of Portland, Maine. Some of the sisters became nuns and sisters in various capacities. One of them joined what would later be the Coast Guard. That's a different thing. Anyway, but the reason that people talk about them and that they're kind of noteworthy is that they were actually biracial. Their mother was an enslaved woman. Their father was an Irish immigrant who held her in slavery. But they were basically white passing. They were sent north as children. It's a long, complicated thing, but you basically couldn't. It was very difficult to free people from slavery in Georgia at the time, even if you wanted to, which is where they were born. And your legal status followed the legal status of your mother, right? So they kind of had this somewhat ambiguous, especially pre-Civil War life in the North, but were kind of allowed. It's interesting because there's evidence that they were various kind of leaders in the Catholic Church kind of knew about their kind of family background, but chose to kind of not say anything, because especially in the 19th century, right, there's these really intense ideas about, if you have any African ancestry, that has implications about your racial status and things like that. I think in ways that aren't as hardline today. What's interesting, and again, they mostly kind of people, it seems like most people kind of just are like, these are white Irish Catholics, right, that they interact with. What's interesting, and there's a really good book about the family if people are interested, called Passing for White, Race, Religion, the Healy Family, 1820 to 1910, I think is the range you get, by James O'Toole. It's kind of like the definitive book on the family. What I'm interested in is how they get remembered starting in the 1950s. In the 1950s, you get this other Jesuit, because Jesuits love to talk about Jesuits. Shout out to my Jesuit friends. No disrespect intended. Love you guys. But so he kind of
many of them are listening right now, by the way.
I'm like, you never know.
No.
I'm like, I'll text them after. What was I going to say? Oh, so this other Jesuit, this guy, Albert Foley, starting in the 40s and 50s, kind of is like, he's really interested in Black Catholic history. He's kind of in this interesting middle ground when you look back at him historically, and that at the time, and he's white, he's a Southerner, he's from Alabama, and he lived and taught in Mobile, Alabama, mostly at Spring Hill College for much of his life, which is a Jesuit school. He was kind of really concerned about segregation and racism within the Catholic Church. And so as part of this broader project, he basically spent a lot of his life trying to convince his fellow white Catholics to not be racist. And it's really interesting because a lot of that took the form of these like workshops that he would hold with people. But he also kind of had this other, I almost think of it as like a narrative project where he was trying to get people to think differently through storytelling. And so he kind of popularizes the Healy family as this example of, basically he's trying to tell his fellow white Catholics, like, hey, Black Catholics have always been around. They've always been part of the church. They've always been, huge contributors to what you think of as American Catholicism. And so, but the way he does that is a little complicated, right? And that he's talking about a family who kind of had this ambiguous status in that regard, who didn't necessarily think of themselves as part of a Black community in any meaningful sense. But what's interesting is, like, since he kind of threw out this initial, like, hey, let's talk about this family, the Healys get just remembered in all these different, often kind of completely different and sometimes like completely contradictory ways, in terms of, they've been talked about. There have been a lot of discussions at Georgetown and College of the Holy Cross about their histories with slavery, right? And the Healys have strong histories at both. They were actually students as children at College of the Holy Cross when it was more of a boarding school than a college in the modern sense. So they're kind of brought into those conversations. Albert Foley kind of brought them into conversations around the civil rights era. There's just all these different ways that they get remembered. And the fact that they kind of have this ambiguous status gives them, it kind of lets you see like different contours of how people are thinking about race and religion and the concept of passing and all this other stuff. So basically, I just hang out being really weird about a specific group of dead people. I think about them way too much. I've read all their letters and diaries. Like that's inherently a little weird, I think.
It's pretty personal.
Yeah. So that's mostly what I'm up to.
Well, that's fascinating.
She is a historian after all.
Don't tell the historians. I do historical work. If I'm around historians, I don't claim to be a historian. I'm like, don't tell them. They have very specific ideas about what that means, and I leave them alone.
Well, awesome. Yeah, that sounds exciting. We're looking forward to that. Hopefully this has been a good experience for you. We'd love to have you on again. To talk about all the other things.
I'm always, as my students can attest, I'm always down to just show up and be really weird about the Shakers. So.
No, this was awesome. I appreciate it, Alex. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on
and teaching us. That's great.
And I will enjoy drinking beverages out of my very cool "I was John's favorite guest" on with Stone Rolling mug.
You've earned it.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Now, after this, you can say "and Tyler's" as well.
Okay, I'll get a Sharpie and kind of.
I'll endorse that. Yeah.
Okay, I'll add on to it maybe, or stick a Post-it note on it to add.
He says that to everyone, by the way.
I would say it's okay. I'll take it.
Thankfully, we're on the record, and on the record, this is the only time I've ever said this. So.
I would say don't ruin my good time, John.
So, no, I'm.
Why do you got to undermine me?
Yeah,
I'm just saying you got to watch out for Tyler.
I was going to compliment you, John, but I don't know if I can do that anymore after you don't let me ask questions. You don't let me compliment our guests at the end of each episode.
I'm not the one that says this is your show. Do what you want. Mute.
Yeah.
That was you. You did that.
Yes, it is your show. You do what you want, and if it's not what I want, I will mute you. That's very. I see no problem with that. I see no problem with that.
All right. Well, thanks again, Alex.
And Alex, the pseudo historian, agrees.
Yes. Yes.
No. Well, thanks, Alex. I appreciate it. This is great.
Yeah, it was really fun.
And John, thank you. It's a pleasure hearing you ask questions, and I'm glad I don't need to do it because you articulate them and you hit the points perfectly. So thank you, John.
Thanks, Tyler. Thank you. Your silence is golden.
It's what I do best. Life's rough and roll on. Bye.